Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session devoted to the Indo-Pacific. We're going to talk about geopolitics today, this afternoon during our session, and also about the economy and the Indo-Pacific. Is it the artisan of global balance? This is going to be coordinated by Mary-Françoise RENARD from the Coordinateur Économiques, who's going to give us an introduction to the session. We're going to try to define what is the Indo-Pacific, this huge economic zone, which takes its name from the strategic position where there's increasing rivalry between the US and China. And we're also going to ask the question as to whether the Indo-Pacific can be the artisan of global balance. So I'm going to present our panel members. We have Françoise NICOLAS. She's the main advisor for Asia at the IFRI, French Institute for International Relations. We have the new Vice Minister for Investment and Industry from Malaysia, Tong LIEW. Thank you very much for being with us, sir. For those of you who don't speak English, don't hesitate to take a headset because we'll have simultaneous interpreting. We have Arnaud with us. You are the co-founder and CEO of International SOS. And we have Denis who is with us. He's a founder and a partner in Cathay Capital. So we're going to start this session with Mary-Françoise RENARD from the Coordinateur Économiques, who is going to start our session by describing what is at stake in our discussion. Thank you very much. To talk about the Indo-Pacific. What is the Indo-Pacific? It's rather a difficult object to define. It's a recent object. It's a supranational object, concept that was defined for geopolitical reasons in order to create a balance between centers of power and also to limit the power of China, it has to be said. So from a geographical point of view, although we can talk about it country by country, it extends from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of the US, including the Middle East, China and India. From an economic point of view, it's an area of intense trade, especially for strategic products such as oil. It has a lot of high level of fisheries. This one thing explains another. Because of these resources, it's a zone of potential military conflict in many areas. And the large maritime area is a very high security environmental importance. The increase in economic and especially military power of China has led the major powers to define an Indo-Pacific strategy, whereas up to now we tended to talk about Asia and Pacific. The European strategy is less based on conflict than the US, since Europe, of course, like the US, wants to strengthen its position, but it's also defending an international order based on respect for law, especially concerning maritime navigation, also based in cooperation and the principles of cooperation on subjects such as fighting against global warming, the effects of which are particularly deleterious in this region. So when we're talking about security in the seas and of the oceans, this is important for the trade flows between the different ports in the region, and also it ensures we have guarantees on procurement of the different natural resources. So freedom of navigation is absolutely vital, and that's why efforts are being made to fight against terrorism and against piracy. Certain areas in this region are particularly crucial, and where there is particular tension, where there could be an interruption or modification of the Silk Road. For example, if there's a conflict between China and Taiwan, this means that Taiwan Strait would be impractical, whereas it's a crucial trade route. A huge number of container ships go through this strait, and this means that there's a trade in oil and semiconductors as well, which goes through this area. In the same thing, another difficult point is due to the discovery of oil and gas, explains that China has taken control of the sparkly Paracel Islands with repeated incidents with the Philippines and territorial demands from neighboring countries such as Malaysia, Indonesia and Vietnam, etc. So theoretically, we need to count on negotiation and diplomacy to be able to overcome these difficulties and differences. Also, the Indo-Pacific region, if we exclude Russia, also comprises three UN Security Council members, but there is no governance institution which makes it possible to guarantee freedom of movement, which makes it possible to define security rules, which would be recognized by all of the countries in this zone. The advantage of this zone is a result of the disorganization of the international system as it was defined at the end of the Second World War. That's why this is because of the end of this system that this area of the Indo-Pacific has increased its influence because of the desire for security and the fears for security. Of course, it's the largest free trade area, agreement. ACP includes the areas inside this area and outside this area. But the only thing that can encourage us to be optimistic is the creation of institutions and new institutions and a new order leading to the creation of a new framework and new rules which would include protection of the commons. And it is institutional organization which we hope will replace an international order which has disappeared in this area and which needs to be rebuilt. If we're being optimistic there, yes. Françoise, Nicolas, to react to what Mary-Françoise has just said. In fact, in the end analysis, we're talking about Asia-Pacific, where this has changed now to Indo-Pacific. Is this for geostrategic reasons or political reasons that we've changed from a free trade area to countries who want to define their strategy from a geopolitical point of view? Yes, well, we have changed our terminology. We're no longer talking about the same thing. Until now, we talked about Asia-Pacific, and Asia-Pacific was more or less Eastern Asia. Asia-Pacific is an area that brings together the three major countries of Northeast Asia, China, Korea, China's, that's not very politically correct, but that's what we're supposed to say, which means China and Taiwan. Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. There are two Koreas as well. We'll forget about North Korea, sorry, but we won't talk about North Korea. They're not really included. So Asia-Pacific was that group to which we could add Australia and New Zealand. So this area was economically very well integrated, in fact, because the regional production networks were organized on that scale. And in a very interesting way, as Mary-Françoise has just reminded us, this region had just had its own institutions created because of the large economic partnership, RCEP. These 15 countries are now part of a huge free trade agreement. When you talk about the 15, the 10 from the ASEAN, the 3 from Northwest Asia, China, Korea, and Japan, and Australia and New Zealand. So it's an island that does include China. Yes, the RCEP is Asia-Pacific for me. For me, this is an area which economically has a real meaning, which is structured in effect, and which has been structured institutionally thanks to this agreement, which is more than a free trade agreement. There are many other provisions in this partnership, the RCEP, which concern investment and goods and services and SMEs as well, lots of other chapters apart from the free trade area part. So this area really does exist. The Indo-Pacific is something that is more vague. I would say it's a non-identified geopolitical object, an OVNI perhaps, unidentified object. It's to define this area, we have China, which may or may not be part of this zone. We have all of the Indian Ocean, right up to the east coast of Africa, or not. If you're an American, for you, in the Indo-Pacific, basically, as we say traditionally, goes from Hollywood to Bollywood. So it stops at India. If you're Japanese, in that case, you emphasize the two oceans, the Indo-Pacific, as the name indicates, underlines the fact that there's two maritime spaces, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and in fact they are connected, as Mary-Françoise said. It is through this huge area that most of world trade takes place, 40% of GDP worldwide. So in this Japanese version, then for Russia it has more of an economic sense. It is the area through which this trade goes. But there's no institutional structure at all for the Indo-Pacific. It all depends on how you envisage these different countries. Now, the last point, is that the US have returned to this area because they had neglected it, moved out of it in economic terms. They had been very present in terms of security with the famous agreement, security agreement with Australia, which led to a lot of talk in France for the reasons we are familiar with. It was a Trafalgar, it was a betrayal by Australia. So the US have been very much present in terms of security, but not so much in economy. So they are back now with a new economic framework for the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific acronym, English acronym. So as part of this, they don't want to include China. We have the US, we have the main 5 economies of ASEAN. We have the Fiji Islands, rather surprisingly. We have Australia and New Zealand. We have Japan, Korea, and that's all. But not China, though. Above all, they don't want China. So Indo-Pacific is rather strange. For me, it's an economic reality for the reasons Mary-Françoise has explained, because of the considerable world trade that goes through that area. So in that sense, it is a reality. On the geopolitical level, it depends who you're talking to. Each country has a different point of view. We'll ask the Vice Minister of Trade and Industry from Malaysia, because Malaysia is a major country in this area, Mr. Chin Tong Liu, and which has always tried to be independent between China and the US, despite its proximity to China. How do you define the Indo-Pacific region?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I apologize for not being able to speak French.
It's okay.
The idea of Asia has a long history. The idea of Asia started in the late 19th century, and it is not just a geographical idea, but it was also adopted by Asians as something that is not West. So you have Japan adopting the idea of Asia, you have India, you have China, you have the Philippines, you have many of those countries during their anti-colonial struggle adopting the idea of Asia. So Asia is now an idea that was adopted at least for a century for many countries. But the idea of Asia Pacific came around the late 80s, early 90s. Came with a very optimistic view about the world, about trade, about relationship with China. And therefore, in the 90s, there was this creation of Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC. So that came from a rather optimistic era of trade of China. But we are now in an era which is less optimistic, and we have this idea of Indo-Pacific. The idea of Indo-Pacific, to a large extent, is number one, originally driven by the US, as the United States always has an Indo-Pacific command. So with some military undertone, and with China as a target. But secondly, it has also a lot to do with Japan and India. And in order to bring in India into the larger questions, and as you know, as a result, Quad was formed. Quad was formed in order to include India. So it was United States, Japan, India, and Australia. So Quad was formed in order to give basis to Indo-Pacific. But India, in many ways, is actually a multipolar player. Modi just visited Putin, and you have India, actually half of India's defense assets is actually from Russia. India is entirely with the United States when it comes to China. However, when it comes to other politics, it is not necessarily 100% with the United States.
C'est du non-alignement.
Sorry?
It's a non-aligned country.
Sense of non-alignment in Southeast Asia, in India, or multi-aligned. Either you are in non-aligned or multi-aligned. The non-alignment movement started in 1955 in Bandung, Indonesia. And it has been part of Malaysia's foreign policy outlook. It has been part of many Southeast Asian countries in ASEAN, where we think that the world, we want to prevent, in order to prevent the world from bifurcating, it is important for as many middle as possible. And this is, in this context, I think France and the European Union has an important role to play.
Thank you. Arnaud VAISSIÉ, une réaction.
Arnaud VAISSIÉ, a reaction with International SOS. You are specialized in health sector and security sector. You work a great deal in China and also in Singapore. How do you define this area? Is it kind of land of opportunity, do you think? The Indo-Pacific zone is the zone of the future, but of the present, especially of the future, in economic terms, because that's where you have the highest growth rates. Is still the case now? Southeast Asia is enjoying strong growth, and Northwest Asia and Vietnam is enjoying very strong growth, and of course, obviously India, as we all know, has a remarkable growth rate. As for China, the growth has slowed, but it's still extremely respectable, and China has great capacity to catch up despite the geopolitical issues. For us at International SOS, our job is to help employees of companies and governmental employees around the world in terms of their health and safety. We are world leaders in that area. The specificity is that we began in Singapore. The group was created in Singapore. I lived there for 14 years. My children were born there. So I've lived in Southeast Asia for a long time. And so this progress we've made, we started from Australia to China. We're in 24 Asian countries, and now, of course, in India, which has become an absolutely key country with the specificity of Singapore. Yes, the specificity of Singapore, which is a bridge, in fact, between the US and China. Because the founder of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, who is a Singaporean de Gaulle in a way, Lee Kuan Yew was one of the first to realize that China was going to become the future major power. And today, there's 74% of the population are Chinese in Singapore. To get into university, you have to speak Mandarin in Singapore, whereas previously Singapore was developed in English. So what does that mean? The Chinese have taken over and have taken over more power? Well, there's been a balance in Singapore with the US because they are economically aligned with the US in Singapore. And there's also a military alliance with the US and an economic alliance with China, which is very important. So to do this, Singapore needs to get closer to other countries. It's a very important driving force for ASEAN. The minister here is a very important player in that. Also, motor of an alliance with France. There's a strong partnership with France as well, because Singapore wants to be close to Europe and to France. So it's a very complicated set of balances, which is very important for Singapore's survival, which is a very open country, open to trade without any customs duties, and is growing very, very remarkably, but with, at the same time, having to deal with a lot of geopolitical tensions. Do you invest? You invest in startups and small Chinese companies in Singapore. So despite these geopolitical tensions, you're continuing to invest. Is it also an important economic area for you? Yes. Let me share with you some of the excitement and the opportunities we have as a worldwide investor, and why the Indo-Pacific is perhaps the greatest opportunity for investment, and it will be in the future years for us at Cathay Capital. As you were saying, I think it represents 40% of worldwide growth. The Indo-Pacific, everybody's looking for growth at the moment, and it's the place where you have 40% of worldwide growth. We were saying the US is starting to become interested in it in economic terms because they've also seen this. What's happening is that it's a place, if you look at Southeast Asia, where very few people have access to basic services, especially financial services with banking cards and insurance, that we are all used to having. So what they're trying to do is to do leapfrog. Instead of going through the step of a traditional banking, they have their phones and they can directly have access to a digital bank. when they can get insurance. Which countries do you mean? The country where it works the best is Indonesia. We have 270 million inhabitants in this country. So it's very dynamic, and services are developing very, very well. And then they are developing the other area, the rest of the other area, especially Singapore, which has a very rigorous financial system with very strong and robust rules for the financial activity. So you have this financial hub, and you have this growth volume, which is absolutely massive. And finally, we also talk a lot about sustainable development. And in this sustainable development is perhaps the area where you have the greatest sustainable development. You might have seen that in India, they have huge pollution issues. In Southeast Asia, they're close to the water, and so if the water level rises, they have real issues. And so all of this development has to be done, and they're being asked to make huge efforts. It's us, in fact, who created this problem initially. We're now telling them to develop without using carbon. And so this is one of the largest areas in terms of industrial decarbonized development. And certain countries, such as Malaysia, I'd like to highlight this. Malaysia has done exceptional work. We have the Ministry for Foreign Investment in terms of semiconductors. Everybody talks a lot about Taiwan, but once you talked about semiconductors, you have to package the semiconductors and everything that goes around that. Malaysia, for example, is becoming the leading country in the world for packaging of semiconductors. I just wanted to share that with you and the excitement we have about this region we're working. So you're still enthusiastic. So, Françoise, Nicolas, it's interesting to see that on a geopolitical point of view, we're looking a lot about the tension around Taiwan. As you said already, all this sparkly islands that Mary-Françoise mentioned, where China wants to take control of certain maritime areas. There's a lot of competition. We know there's a lot of tension also with the Philippines, strong tensions with military movements. How do you explain these tensions, and how far do you think it can go? When you listen to the panel, we get the impression that economy plays the most important role, but nevertheless, the tensions are increasing. And this is because of the rivalry between the two superpowers, the US and China. Yes, that's true. We do have tensions also between the economic outlooks in this area, which are very, very bright. That's where everything is happening. That's where the actions are occurring in this Indo-Pacific area extended to China. This is where a lot of the world growth will take place. So clearly, economically, it's very, very promising. Geopolitically, it's much more complicated. And exactly, the two things are linked. The reason why there are tensions between the US and China in this area is because this is exactly where most of the worldwide growth will take place. So everybody's interested. If there are economic promises, there is a lot of jealousy and a lot of interest. There's a tension between the US and China. Up to now, it had been the US that was playing the leading role in this area. China has emerged, and now China believes that most of the South China Sea belongs to it, and the East China Sea belongs to them. And for them, this is part of Chinese sovereignty. Not everybody agrees with that. But it's true that there are tensions, and so these tensions have been exacerbated because there are very strong growth outlooks. And as I was saying earlier, what's interesting is that America's always been very active in the area of security with the Quad and the Focus, and all of this has been led by the US up to now. Now they realize they cannot stay at the same level of just focusing on security and nothing else with the countries in the region, particularly in the Southeast Asia. They regretted the fact that the US had pulled out economically. The withdrawal of America from the Trans-Pacific Agreement, which the US itself had set up, that's because of Trump. The withdrawal that was launched by Trump was seen in a very negative light by the Southeast Asian countries, and so we have a return of America now, but the return that they're putting in place is really against China above all, because I was saying earlier in the economic framework of Indo-Pacific, China isn't really included. So we have this tension between the geopolitical sphere and the economic sphere. Mr. Tong, you in Malaysia, you were saying that Malaysia is trying to have this strategy of being non-aligned. So you have investments from American companies, and at the same time, your main trade partner is China. Are you sometimes afraid of China?
Malaysia is not afraid of anyone, but we are worried about the world that becomes bifurcated because we are with both sides. Malaysia constitutes 7% of global semiconductor trade, 13% of back-end semiconductor trade, and 23% of US semiconductor trade. So United States semiconductor trade, of which actually 23% comes from Malaysia's export. Thus, we are closely linked to the US economy. At the same time, we are also linked to the Chinese economy.
Surtout, vous êtes beaucoup plus près.
Much closer.
Quickly.
Well, we're not necessarily closer just to China because a lot of those trade eventually end up in the United States. For example, the semiconductor trade, a lot goes to China from Taiwan, Malaysia, then to China, and to be sold to the US. So that trade link is very, very well linked, but now there is a challenge. The challenge is Chinese technology has grew too fast, very fast, whereas the US middle class has shrunk. And therefore, US has problem buying or consuming what is being produced in China and Asia. And the US, because of the US shrinking middle class, this idea that United States can forever be the consumer or importer of last resort is now being questioned. And that's where I think Chinese economy, Southeast Asian economy will have to rethink. Malaysia wants to be a middle-class society. We are still a triangle society where the poor is bigger than the middle class. But we want to have a bigger middle class. We want Southeast Asia to have a bigger middle class because with a bigger middle class, we become a market and not just a producer. And that, I think, is the framework that we need to change. And we need Southeast Asia to be richer so that we do not depend on just thinking of selling to the US.
But when there are tensions around Taiwan, quand il y a des tensions autour de Taïwan qui sont liées justement au mouvement.
When there are tensions around Taiwan because of Chinese behavior, how does Malaysia react to that? Or the Sparkly Islands, how do you react to that? Do you feel threatened by China sometimes?
It is important that we will have to engage China. We engage China. This is not the only issue that we are dealing with China. There are a basket of issues that we have to deal with when we talk to the Chinese. But what we are hoping is to influence the Chinese that they will have to see that the South China Sea is not a competition between the United States and China. We are hoping that we can convince them. Not easy. But secondly, even if the Chinese see the South China Sea as a competition between China and the United States, they will have to see that the neighbors, their territorial difference with the neighbors shouldn't be the main challenge. They should desegregate the challenge. What I think is a problem now is because it is being perceived in China that anything that has something to do with South China Sea is tied to the competition between US and China. I think there needs to be decoupling. Decoupling the territorial differences, territorial claims between China, Malaysia, China, the Philippines, China, Vietnam, has to be differentiated and decoupled from China-US competition in the South China Sea. Because otherwise, when all this is entangled, it will not be good because it may entangle with Taiwan as well. It's all part of the package.
Vous vouliez peut-être réagir, Arnaud?
Would you like to react? And Arnaud VAISSIÉ, about this idea of decoupling. It's the US have put in place a containment strategy of China. And this is something that is felt very strongly in this region. Here the minister is saying with no containment, we have to look at this country by country and look at these things separately. So yeah, as an economic player, how do you see things? The US have done what they called a Pacific tilt. They've pivoted towards the Pacific, which is the essential policy of the US, and its policy has three levels: military, economic, and diplomatic. On the economic level, they have this re-engagement that we've just been talking about. On the military level, they have a redeployment in the Philippines particularly, but not only that. and especially in all the Pacific Islands with Australia, where there's a very strong competition with China there too, to regain influence in each of these small countries, the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Samoa, etc. Papua New Guinea, where the Chinese were taking up strong positions, and the Americans and Australians are now pushing back and taking over, not the control of these countries, they're regaining influence again in these countries, so that they will be, these countries will be aligned with US instead of China.
So the decoupling is necessary because it's the growth, the zone of growth. Americans are investing a lot in Vietnam. They're investing intensely in India and the Middle East. The Middle East, Indo-Pacific, depends on the definitions. You know, if those regions belong to Indo-Pacific zone. That's where the investments take place. And in Indonesia, there's a spectacular growth. Indonesia is becoming a powerful country in Southeast Asia and is pulling out of its underdevelopment. You know, that was very strong for a long time. So they're really growing. So there needs to be a decoupling, but it remains the zone of tensions. And enterprises today are used to living in permanent crisis. Countries are used to living in a permanent state of crisis, where there are successive crises that overimpose. It's not because of crisis that we stop. And so investments will continue everywhere. Only in China, maybe foreign investments are stabilizing. But this is for domestic reasons. That is, the power in China, Xi Jinping, has decided to proceed with sort of... When foreigners complain that they're mistreated in China, it's not true. It's not the foreigners, it's the whole of the business that is mistreated. Xi Jinping decided that the business should be subject to the party. And the private business is now controlled in China, and so international investments, whether French or what have you, German or US, has stabilized in China and will tend probably to drop, but remaining at levels where the stocks are very high. It's important to understand that the political vision of Xi Jinping is that he wishes to control the private sector. He has overtaken the control of tech companies, replacing the charismatic leaders, the founding members, by leaders that are less known but control. Is that good for the Chinese growth? Well, a priori, I would say that for us liberal countries, it's bad, but in liberal economies, but it would be rational and logical that the Chinese growth be less efficient in the future from the moment the state regime is less pro-enterprise. And we see foreign investments today are in a pause. We've stopped. And so we can all hope, you know, if China continues to grow as fast as in the past, it will continue to grow. It will continue to grow. The problem is not that it will stop, but will it be on the same slope as before, that is from, 6 to 10%, or is it on a new slope of 3 to 5%? Which is the case today, which is an enormous difference because the U.S. Themselves have 3%, so there's no catching up of China on the U.S. Denis Barrier, so you insist a lot on technologies, you invest a lot. Does this geopolitical context have an impact on your choices? Yeah, well, we talked about decoupling, quite interesting because it's maybe the region where we've considered that it's not necessarily in a decoupling state. So we don't have the choice between China and the US for the moment, and for several reasons. First of all, we talked about security. Well, the military alliances that exist, everybody chooses its camp, but it's not as essential as in other regions of the world, it's not as critical. And in the end, it's a region where there's no war for the moment, as there is in Europe. There's a war next door. We talk about China and Taiwan, but historically, when did China declare war to a country in its history? Well, not often. Not often. China does not wage war, so there are tensions for different reasons, but it stays reasonable when you're concerned as an investor. When we talk about the population, there's a Chinese population that's strong. We said in Singapore, Mandarin Chinese became a reference language, and at the same time we see the Chinese investing intensely on the supply chain. So they want less supply chain in China. So one of the zones where they can apply their supply chain, deploy their supply chain, is Southeast Asia. While China is automizing its supply chain because they have a problem with the pyramid of ages. It's an aging population, so they're trying to automatize everything in China. They're investing massively there. And China, for its electrical cars, for example, with the zone that is the strongly developed, Indonesia, with a population of 270 million. So investing massively. And same as when we create activity when there are exports. So it's not. So of course there are tensions, because there's competition. But as far as an investor is concerned, given the growth, it's interesting. So Françoise Nicolas, Indo-Pacific, can it be an artisan of the world balance? We talk of tensions, yes. But there is this question of Taiwan, the issue of Taiwan. Xi Jinping talks about Taiwan very often. We will military take action within 5 years. In the discourse, it's stronger and stronger. So could there be a war? Would the U.S. be involved? We're not talking about North Korea because very often we hear threats, nuclear threats. Japanese are working on shelters and everything. So everything happening around Taiwan and everything happening around China is not negligible. No, it's true. It's a zone that is tense. But maybe a first point on the risk of a war between China and Taiwan. Honestly speaking, I don't believe it will happen for many reasons. But I think that the key reason is that China is much more ready to engage into a low-level conflict and eventually take over the control of Taiwan, but without military action. So we will choke slowly but surely Taiwan to try to take over Taiwan again. I think it's more plausible, more rather than thinking of a military attack. I think they will. I hope I'm right, but just to say that there are tensions in this region, in this zone, that's unquestionable, but this being, like operators say, it's a growth area, a zone of growth. And if I want to answer a question, can Indo-Pacific region be an artisan of stability? I would say no and no again. First of all, in my opinion, as a geopolitical analyst, the Indo-Pacific zone is not an actor. It's not a player. It's a field where a lot of tensions take place. Where, of course, the essential part of trade happens, but it's not an actor. So it cannot be an artisan. So I say no on the first segment of this question. On the second aspect, can it be an artisan of stability? For the reasons I just gave, I say, I don't think, no. I think I only see frictions and tensions. But again, I will say that if growth is a stability factor, well, yes, this zone is a zone of stability. But the Japanese strategy in the region that pushes what Japan calls a free and open Indo-Pacific, it has as a goal to guarantee the stability of this zone, guarantee the freedom of sailing, of shipping, guaranteeing that trade will continue to take place freely in this zone, and this would stabilize the whole of the global economy. So if you're on the Japanese side, you can answer yes. But otherwise, if you look at that without taking sides, this zone is not an actor, it's just a place of confrontation. It cannot be a factor of system stability. Jean-Jacques, can you react to this, to what Françoise Nicolas just said? Can it be a zone of stability, Mrs. Ching-Chong Liu, like the vision of Japan, this Indo-Pacific area?
Indo-Pacific, I agree with you, would not be an actor, and it's not an actor. But ASEAN, which is an organization that has 10 member states, ASEAN, together with many other non-aligned actors, maybe Brazil, maybe Latin American countries, and at some point on some issues, EU, France, these actors will be able to be artisan of global balance. We may enter into an a la carte world where we are no longer tied to alliances very strictly, but we are entering into a more a la carte menu where countries chooses issue to work together. And we want to see that. We want to see that middle becoming strong and therefore preventing bifurcation of supply chain, preventing the world being bifurcated.
Arnaud VAISSIÉ, un monde à la carte, c'est ce que vient de dire M. Ching.
An a la carte world, you know, by the menu. We didn't talk much about France. You know a lot about the relationship between France and Singapore. France is at the origin of this diplomacy, of the sort of like an equilibrium balance in this region. Is it meaningful? Well, yeah. I think that the Indo-Pacific is not the artisan, but it's the stake of world balance. That's where it will happen, because in the U.S. opinion, what's happening in the Indo-Pacific is much more important than what's happening in Ukraine, despite the American engagement in Ukraine. Their real concern is Indo-Pacific for the U.S. relationship with China, with India, and with the whole of the countries of this zone. For us, France, if we are on the lateral side, we have a real problem in Numia, New Caledonia. We have an island that is destabilized, where we haven't managed to take over control. We have more and more police forces there, and the security situation is absolutely out of control. And it's a good example of what's happening in the Indo-Pacific region, that there is an influence, a foreign influence. We talk about Azerbaijan, but probably a mix of Russia and China behind all this to try to destabilize Numia, New Caledonia, and question the French presence in the Pacific. And it's not obvious that we will manage to recover control of New Caledonia. So we see to what extent this tension through the entire zone, which is the largest in the world and most densely populated, and with the largest economies, because the world economy today is the Indo-Pacific zone and the U.S. And you have 80% of growth is located there, if not 90% of the world growth, the global growth. That's where it's happening. And so we clearly see this unbalance country by country. We are very present because we have the vision of what's happening. We accompany governments and groups to implement their strategy in the field of security and health, and to use our own staff. So we see how they operate. And today, this tension exists practically everywhere. ASEAN can be a stability factor because the ASEAN is pro-US, but quite neutral, finally. And it's the zone that can, yes, bring forth a balance, and I share your point of view on that. And even for us, we're based in Singapore and in KL, in Kuala Lumpur, which is a very important economic hub for us. We have 500 staff members in KL. It's our regional headquarters. But we see that we are in a period of total transfer where the geopolitical balances are changing, shifting. Taiwan, well, I share the same opinion to say that the U.S. would probably not attack or wage war on Taiwan. But on the other hand, there's a possibility that of misunderstanding between the American fleet at risk and China. Something that can happen anytime. You know, a match can light it up, so it's very difficult to measure, very risky, and that's where there's a risk, and it's a real risk, and that would really question growth, put in question growth and the balance if there was a conflict around Taiwan. Well, look at Ukraine. It has an impact on European growth, but it hasn't totally put in question European growth. So it depends on the U.S., the reaction of the U.S. But if there's a real conflict and American sanctions on China, that's another story. We're not there yet because clearly it's not what the U.S. want, and nor do the Chinese. The relationships are much better than 12 months ago between China and the U.S. Yes, okay, I agree. If there's a conflict, it will be the result of a mistake, an error, an incident. But it would have an immediate, colossal impact on the world growth rate and global exchanges, because it's through this zone, in this zone, that all the trade takes place. Now, contrary to Ukraine, I think the impact would be much stronger and much more immediate. Denis Barrier? Well, I'm an optimist. So I'm in technology, so I'm an optimist. So I have to be an optimist if I'm in technologies. And we talked about France. Well, it's a zone where France is strongly present, has a strong presence. And we also talked about the economy of nickel in New Caledonia. So it's a place where France has a very important natural resource. I'm thinking about New Caledonia. But so from that, we have something, we have a word, we have a presence, and to ensure that these tensions, general tensions, do not worsen. I think I would say that the actors of the zone are busy on that. We see groupments. We're used to Europe, but now we see a lot of initiatives with the different countries. People are trying to talk about eventually common currency. This is being discussed, so we're pretty far from having this sort of like local euro. But there are ideas that are being discussed of fusions, merging, free trade agreements, and so on and so forth. And so, but they're not separated countries, but it's a sort of like a community of Indo-Pacific community that is being that could exist and can contribute to the world's stability. Notably because nobody wants to hinder economic growth, global economic growth. So we pay attention to what's happening, but I think that we can participate, we can be active there, and I think that we can participate in the world stability. Mr. LIEW, can the European community be an example, like in terms of integrated regionalization? Is that an example?
That ASEAN, Malaysia will be chairing ASEAN next year. We hope that ASEAN will be a more prosperous place. We hope that ASEAN will integrate and increasingly become a common market, learning from EU. But at the same time, it's important that we in ASEAN have to change the way we think. Because for many, many years, American companies and European companies come to ASEAN and tell Malaysia, you're competing with Vietnam, Malaysia, you're competing with Indonesia, Malaysia, you're competing with regional countries. I think we in ASEAN will have to move away from thinking that we are competing with each other, but see that we are one supply chain and we are one common market. That will mean that we will have to start thinking of setting a floor on competing to race to the bottom on wages. We have to set a floor so that we don't compete to race to the bottom on tax incentive for companies from, say, Europe or from US. And we'll have to set a floor so that we don't race to the bottom on destroying the environment. All this required new thinking, and I hope the new generations of ASEAN leaders will think so. But message for France and for Europe is, it is in the interest of France and Europe to spend more time on Southeast Asia. To understand, to spend more time on Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, whatever you call it, because there is a lot that will happen there. There's a lot that is already happening there. There will be a lot that will happen there. And it's important that we get more engagement from France and EU. And it's also important that EU and France see that region as a potential future market, so that there's a need to enrich Southeast Asia, to make Southeast Asia richer, and it becomes a market for the world. Thank you.
Vous vouliez réagir?
Yes, je partage complètement ce que vient de dire.
I share totally what Ching Tong Lu just said. Fully agree. There's a lack of engagement on behalf of France for Asia. France is engaged with China, and starting with India, but globally the French commitment with Asia is insufficient. Why? Well, because it's too far. Because we don't have, Vietnam. Well, we wanted to engage around Vietnam, but Vietnam today is not under French influence, far from that. And it's Singapore that is the country, the hub, with which we have the most contacts. 2/3 of our investments are from Singapore. The stock is essentially in Singapore. So we need to be more involved. There are few ministerial visits. When you compare the German and the French, there's a German minister in Southeast Asia each month that visits Southeast Asia. A French minister in Southeast Asia at best each quarter or each semester. So the level of engagement is not the same. The level of understanding is not the same, and that needs to be improved. And as a corporate head, I share the idea that corporate head has to be optimistic but realistic. But optimism consists in knowing the people. We have to know Malaysia better. We have to spend time there, and not through video conferences. A few minutes for questions from the room. 2 questions, yes. Good afternoon. Thank you for this debate. We didn't address India. We didn't talk about India, the relationship between India and China, especially in terms of tensions. We're talking about world balance. I would like to know your opinion on this relationship. Second aspect is thinking of this new COMAC, the Chinese builder, who will certainly in the future be at the level of Boeing or Airbus, and that will turn the region. People will travel a lot in this region, much more than what we have today. Because it's a highly densely populated region. It will probably develop trade also. François-Nicolas, on the tension between India and China, it's obvious, and there have been some victims recently, some in the Himalaya region. So tension is real. There's a very strong competition between these two countries, which doesn't make things simpler when it comes to the regional cooperation. That's why we see that China is participating in some regrouping, and India other regroupments, but they're seldom in the same instances or in the same organizations. Another factor of tension. But I think that in the debate, we haven't talked enough about India, which is now an important player in the region, but which was considered until now as marginal compared to Southeast. Few exchanges between Southeast Asia and India has changed a lot in the recent past. We had at the beginning look east from India. Look east, that's what India said. So, and that was Southeast Asia. They only looked, and this look east policy was transformed into an act, a decree. And so we have much stronger ties between India and Southeast Asia. And India is much better integrated in this network of production networks. If we talked about the company, Chinese company, aircraft, yeah, well, trade, cars. Essential debate today. We know the Chinese have a production capacity that is superior at a lower cost, so they can export. We'll have custom barriers in Europe, so that the 38 or 40% do not apply. We know that we see that manufacturers in Europe are advancing in a dispersed orders, between the Germans and the French. We don't proceed in the same way. We don't work together. But manufacturing, car manufacturing is very important in terms of employment, so in terms of jobs, so it's critical for the months to come. Mary-Françoise, your reaction? Maybe we take the next question. Before another question, yes. Thank you for this very interesting debate. I'd just like to answer concerning COMAC. COMAC is an aircraft manufacturer that exists since 15 years. And they have just had their first aircraft certified 6 months ago. So we can think that to develop the Asians' airspace, it'll take a few decades before they manage, because you know that the aerospace industry is a sector that tries to work on economies of scale, and they're not there yet. But we know with Chinese it can go very fast. Just one question regarding Taiwan. You said that there are many reasons that lead you to think that there will not be an armed conflict with China. I would like that you develop that, because with my students, for example, I share that opinion, but I don't have the arguments when I talk to my students. So thank you very much for giving me some arguments to that effect. Well, I'll answer, but first of all, I'll hand over the floor to Mary-Françoise on COMAC. COMAC, the objective is that China be less dependent of foreign products. It's not the idea of developing traveling facilities that are already very intense, than to develop a domestic industry that can compete with foreign industries. In Taiwan, now, why I think China will not invade tomorrow? Well, first, the Taiwan Strait is not wide, but it's wide, and you know, debarking is difficult. And in the Taiwan Strait, you have a lot of sea currents. That's what I was told. That would make an attack quite complicated. And there are other political elements that weigh in the balance. I think that Xi Jinping has other things in mind for the moment. He had other problems to tackle, domestically speaking. So I'm not sure it's a priority for him. So there are two elements I think are important that lead me to believe that it's not for tomorrow. Mary-Françoise, to conclude rapidly, we saw that the Indo-Pacific is not an actor. It's not the Indo-Pacific that can develop a strategy. On the other hand, as far as the Indo-Pacific space, we see that tensions that come from all the world are present, and the stability and peace in the Indo-Pacific region is what will impact the rest of the world, and the stability of the rest of the world depend on that. Thank you, Mary-Françoise. Thank you, Tong Liu. Thank you, Arnaud, Denis, François, NICOLAS. Thank you all. Have a very nice evening. Thank you.